and welcome to the First United Methodist Church in Bowling Green, Missouri. We hope that you enjoy what you're about to see, and you can find us at the corner of Broadway and Church Streets at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. Or you can find us at bgmethodist.org and on Facebook at Bowling Green First United Methodist Church. Now, throughout this series, we've been asking big questions, and today it was your turn. Throughout this series, folks have been turning in questions that they wanted answered, and today we answer them. Now, we didn't get to all of them, so stay tuned for more videos where we take on some of these other questions. But for now, hear what some of those answers are. So, there we go. So this is the Sunday where you all have been turning in questions for several weeks now. And I have a list of them, and this is the chance where I'm going to answer those and any that you might have this morning that you maybe just thought of or you've been holding on to watch me squirm. So, someone have a question they want to... Let me set that there. Anyone have any question, unless it's technology, apparently I'm not so good with that this morning. But anyone have any question they want to start off with, or I can jump into some of the ones you've given me already?
I have a question that was addressed to me the other day.
Okay.
An individual approached me and wanted to, take me to his church and said that the church you currently go to, if you go to on Sundays, is not the Sabbath, and you're not doing the teachings of the Lord because you go to church on Sunday, not Saturday. What day is the Sabbath?
That's a really good question, and that's probably something that we probably all run up against at some point in time. Traditionally, in the Jewish faith, Sabbath is on Saturday. That was the last day of the week, and that was when the Sabbath was. In the Christian faith, that has changed over time. It started off we kept the same thing, and I don't remember exactly when it was that it shifted, but now we keep Sunday as the Sabbath day as a testament to Jesus rising on Easter morning. And so that we have Sunday now because of Easter, we treat Sunday as the Sabbath. And so really either one works. There is no hard and fast rule towards either one. And what we're realizing in this day and age when folks are moving around so much as it is, because there is no hard and fast day, lots of things happen now on Sunday they didn't used to. So there aren't too many blue laws around anymore. I remember when I was a kid, there used to be places we couldn't go on Sunday morning. There weren't many of them at that time, but there were still some we couldn't go to on Sundays. But the most important thing about the Sabbath now that we're figuring out is that whether it's on Saturday or Sunday, or maybe even if it's on Wednesday, that we all really need a day. Some day in the week that we can take and we can treat as Sabbath. Where we take steps back from what we do through the rest of the week, where we take some time to rest and reflect. Whether it is we find a church to go to on that odd day of the week, or whether we still go on Sunday, but we still have that day of the week that we set apart. That's really what we're finding is really important, and not just in terms of our religious life, but even in general, for our general health, it's good to have that one day a week. So it could be. Their question to you is saying, well, it's not a true Sabbath. There's not really any guidelines for when the Sabbath is supposed to be. As much as we need to make sure we take that Sabbath day and take the Sabbath and keep it holy. And find that day to take and to spend apart from the other stuff that's going on in our lives where we can rest and reflect and kind of come back to a new, to a good state of equilibrium so that we can go forward. Does that make sense?
Well, this individual who approached me, your answer was a lot more politically correct than his, and so in a very polite way, I told him where he could take his Sabbath. I was just happy where I go to church.
And that's the trouble we find sometimes. We have a lot of folks who will come up and say, "This is what you absolutely have to do."
Right.
The only trouble with that is they'll say that, they may base it on a certain part of Scripture in the Bible, and I can find some place, if I have enough time to sit down and figure out, I can find some place or 5 places that says, no, that's not exactly true. So a lot of who we are and what we believe and say and do is based on a lot of tradition. It's based on a kind of a certain understanding of Scripture, but it's not necessarily, it's not necessarily, it's not written in stone. That the biggest challenge for us is to remain faithful, to hear what God calls us to do, and try and find that new way of understanding things so we are holding to what God tells us, even in maybe a very different time that we live in now.
In reference to that, though, in the scripture, doesn't it reference the Sabbath as the day that we celebrate, like you said, the rising in Christ? But isn't that to continue throughout, the Sabbath, the Sabbath, the Sabbath?
Then, in an ideal world, yes, that would be the case. In the Tom raises before, 2 Toms, oh, okay. Good thing Tom Owens is the good sport. He threw the curveball at me this morning. It is the case, that in an ideal world, we'd go, the Sabbath would have been on Saturday. That would have been the 7th day of creation when God rested. And he tells us, take the Sabbath and keep it holy. We would have just followed after that, week after week, we would have kept on that same day. As times have changed and as the world has changed around us, that's not always been the case. There have been times when the Jews weren't able to keep the Sabbath very well, whether they were in exile or in slavery or other things were going on. Sometimes our day-to-day needs of living in the world we live in changes what we do. We manage to, in Christian tradition, especially after the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Catholic Church and kind of being a solidifying force in Europe to keep Europe from falling completely into anarchy, we kind of really established Sunday as being the Sabbath day. They codified that, made it legal. That's where we see then the growth of the early versions of the blue laws that we then had in the United States. But that was more kind of a practical matter, and that was established a little bit later. And so sometimes we do things, we kind of bend to practical necessity of living out our everyday lives in the context we are. We try and find a way of making sure that we're still keeping the spirit of the commandment, even if we are keeping the letter of it. That's sometimes that's the difference. It's between the spirit and the letter of the law, so to speak. More important, I would rather we err on the side of keeping the spirit of it than trying to keep the letter of it. I'll take I got a couple of easier questions and then some other harder questions that I got in the middle of you'll have some really good questions this go around. And one of them was, this was one of the easier ones to answer, was the cross and flame. Where does that come from in the Methodist Church? Because we see that everywhere. I remember this was several years ago. How many of you have seen the Today Show in the summers where they do the big weddings on there? Yeah. Several years ago, my old district superintendent, Steve Cox, he had a couple that he had known when they were younger that were getting married, and they were on there, and they were going to get married on national TV, and they asked him to come and do the wedding ceremony. And that was about the one day you ever saw all the Methodists in Heartland, the old Heartland North District, all glued to our TVs, waiting to see Steve on national TV. And so it comes on, and it shows up, and there is Steve standing there in his black robe, and he's got his white stole on with a great big cross and flame on either side, and a bunch of us Methodist nerds started cheering really loudly in the confines of our own houses and offices so that no one else looked at us funny. But we were really excited because we saw the cross and flame. There it was. And to this day, the cross and flame is still one of the best designed logos that's out there. It's simple, it's to the point, but it's very memorable. And you see it. You can see it all over the place, and when you see it, that that's the Methodist Church. And it came about in 1968, was what we called the Uniting Conference. That was when the Methodist Church joined with the Evangelical United Brethren, and we became the United Methodist Church. As a part of that, they commissioned a group of folks to go out, and they said, we need something that identifies us as Methodists, so kind of commissioned them to go out to design a logo. They had a huge number of different ideas that they put together before they finally settled on our cross and flame. And they did, and they put that together for several different reasons. On the one side, you have the cross that signifies that we are Christian people, that we are followers of Jesus Christ. And on the other part of it, you have this 2-part flame that's on there, on the side of it. And a part of that reason is to remind us of Pentecost, when the church was formed, when the tongues of fire came down and stayed on the heads of the apostles and signifies the birth of the church. And the other part of it another part of it is to remind us of our own founder, John Wesley, who had his Aldersgate experience which was kind of really is seen as the start of the Methodist Church, when he kind of changed in important ways. Wesley, up until that point in his life, had been kind of a failure. He had tried to be a missionary in Georgia to the Indians. That didn't go so well. If someone really wanted to, they would make a miniseries out of John Wesley's life, and it would be great because no one would believe this actually happened, but this was his life. He literally leaves Georgia just ahead of the law who were trying to arrest him. There's a whole other story back behind it, so he gets back to England finally. He's depressed, he doesn't know what he's doing, he doesn't know where he's going, and he finds himself at Aldersgate. And he hears coming out through the church that was there, the sound of someone reading from Martin Luther's introduction to the book of Romans. Now, we value in the church today charismatic preaching and teaching and folks who can keep your attention through all these things that are going on. Martin Luther was German. He wrote like a German, and which meant that it was thick, it was dense, and it was not all that inspiring. Yet this was what it was that John Wesley hears, and things click into place. And this is where where he makes the statement. He says that my heart was strangely warmed. And that has become kind of a defining moment for us as Methodists, because it was after that moment then that Wesley goes on to start all these class meetings and to start what would be the beginnings of the Methodist Church, and then sends folks off to the United States to start these class meetings that eventually begin to make churches, and the churches then spread across the continent to the point that there are some historians that call the 1800s the Methodist century, because we were at the forefront of the movement to the West. Every place you went, there was probably going to be a Methodist church not too far behind if it wasn't already there. And so that's the other part of that symbolism is we have the cross for Jesus, and we have the flame that reminds us of Pentecost and the birth of the church, but also John Wesley and his experience where his heart was strangely warmed, where he finally figured out and understood who God is for him, and really we begin to see the beginnings of the Methodist Church from there. So that was one of the questions that you all gave me. If at any point through here you have a question that comes up, just shout it out or something, but I can keep going through the list that you gave me. Another one was, I got this, so one of the ones, sometimes I get questions and they stop and make me think. And this one was, the question goes, when we say the Lord's Prayer, we say, and lead us not into temptation. First of all, we have to be able to get that out of our mouths, lead us not into temptation. I always stumbled over that for many years before I could finally say it well. But does that mean that God is leading us into temptation? Because that's what we say, and we assume that that's not what it means, but, how do we get there? And this actually, when I started looking at this, come to find out, it's something that theologians have been dealing with every once in a while throughout the history of the church is, what do we do with this? Because the thought could be that, well, is God tempting us? Well, there's a couple things we know. First, from James chapter 1, verse 13, we're told that God doesn't tempt us. So we got to kind of set that aside. And then we also know, when Paul writes to the Romans, he says, I'm not going to separate myself from you. So he's with us, and he's not going to tempt us. So we've got kind of those two pieces there. But where does this come from? Well, we've got to take that whole thing kind of as a statement. It's not just, and lead us not into temptation, but it continues on. It says, but deliver us from evil. Now here's where we've got to begin to kind of put things together, because in Luke chapter 11, this gets us when Jesus gives the Lord's Prayer to the disciples for the first time. This is, when Jesus is telling them not to be showy in their religious faith, not to do things just to be seen to be religious people. And so he does all that. He puts all that out there, and he says, when you pray, don't try and be showy about your faith. Instead, just pray this way. And he gives us the Lord's Prayer. But when he gets to this part, he says, and lead us not into temptation, I'll get it out, but deliver us from the evil one. This is where we've kind of changed things over the years in our tradition with the Lord's Prayer. Is in most of our traditions, we've dropped off the evil one, but that's kind of an important piece of this. Because for them, that was signifying what this was what that statement was all about. When we're talking about the evil one, we're talking about the struggle between good and evil, between Jesus on one side and the evil one on the other. And the disciples hearing this for the first time would have gone, I get that, I know that, this I understand. And so we have kind of this two-piece thing that's going on. And sometimes it's easier to start with the last part of this, and deliver us from the evil one. Deliver us from the evil that is going on because we know we can't do it on our own, is in effect what they're saying. And that's good for us to hear and to remember, because if you remember back when we were talking in Revelation, one of the things that we talked about a lot was we know how this story ends, that God wins, evil doesn't. That God has that power over evil. And so we have to remember that. We have to remember that God has that power to deliver us from that evil one. But it's also helping us to set up this judgment that was taking place. When Jesus is telling them, lead us not into temptation, it's not that God is tempting us, because that's not what God does. But it's a statement of fear on the part of the people saying the prayer. Saying that we know that judgment is coming. And for folks at that time, they thought it was coming in their lifetime, that they would see that final judgment would come. And so they were saying, and lead us not into temptation, because we don't know if we're going to make the right choice in the middle of all of that. And that scares us. And we don't know how we're going to be able to handle that. And so lead us not into that place of judgment that is coming, because we're afraid of what our response is going to be in the middle of that. But deliver us from the evil one, the evil that is out there that is going to try and do this, because we know you, God, have that power. And so we take that whole statement kind of as its own phrase, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. We put all of that together that gets our fear of maybe we aren't going to be able to hold up when faith becomes hard. But on the other side of that, knowing that God will deliver us because he has that kind of power. For us in this day and age, I think, that's, well, we don't have to worry necessarily about the day of judgment coming. It's probably not going to happen in our lifetime, or it could happen tomorrow. We just don't know when. But that's not something we focus on. But for us, we all know that there are going to be times when faith is going to be hard. And when that faith is hard, it can be kind of scary and frightening, and are we going to be able to hold up against that when it comes? But we remember that God is the one that has the power to deliver us from that, and that's where we place our hope. So that's kind of, God doesn't lead us into temptation, but he is the one that recognizes our fear and brings us out of those times of trial and trouble when we are afraid. Another question from you all before I make the next dive into the next one. Another one that I got was make sure I'm going to the right place. Another question that I got was on this idea of free will, and how do we deal with that? Is it there? How do we talk to other people about it? More importantly, what do we do when we're faced with folks that will say, well, there is no such thing as free will? Because that's a thing that's out there, that people will say that there is no such thing as free will. So what do we do with that? Well, the first thing we've got to know is that this is a big, complicated, hairy, thorny issue. This idea of free will. Because at different points in time in church history, there have been folks that have been judged harshly for believing in free will. One of the church doctrines that comes out of John Calvin was this idea of predestination, that says that we are predestined whether or not we are going to be saved, that's basically what he said. The heart of that is that God already knows who's going to be saved and who's not going to be saved. And that comes out of Romans chapter 9, I think. I've got it written down, I'll have to look it back up. But the place where Paul writes and says, that God foreknew that some are predestined to be saved. Now, a little bit of time went on, and then this idea of double predestination comes up. This is why theologians should never be allowed to write anything, because we just build on things that are already there. We make complicated things even more complicated. So we have this idea of double predestination comes up that says some are going to be saved and the rest are going to be sent to hell. Because if God already knows who's going to be saved, then obviously by the virtue of logic, God also knows who's going to be going to hell. And then the question becomes, well, how do you know who's going to go where? And this is where the theological hoops come up that folks have got to jump through to make this all work and make this all happen. And it was at the time you said, well, you know you're going to be saved because you're going to feel this overwhelming compulsion to go to church, to be a faithful person. This was the way of saying if you went to church, basically you were going to be okay, you were going to be saved because all you have to do is say, well, you're going to feel this compulsion to go to church anyway. That's how you are going to know. Well, for me, that's a really unsatisfying answer. And it only makes sense because the ways that logic and theology and reason and philosophy make sense a lot of times. And so that's where the challenge comes from in that. As time has gone on, we've realized even that doctrine of predestination has taken some steps back and said, well, we didn't really understand it all that well back then. Instead, what it really is saying is that in Jesus coming, by Him coming to save us from our sins, that is predestination right there. Jesus coming and giving the possibility for everyone to be saved, that is predestination. Basically, we've now watered it down to where everyone was to begin with. And so it really doesn't do us a whole lot of good to get focused onto that. But you're still hear folks talk about it. We spent a lot of time in seminary talking about predestination. And the trouble was that folks thought, well, then, if that was the case, then that means we don't have any choice in the matter, and then what good is what we do anyway? We don't really have any free will in the middle of all of this. Now, you've heard me preach on this, probably on a number of occasions, I think, at this point, that I do believe we do have free will. Otherwise, God wouldn't have spent so much time in trying to pull us back from making bad choices, making bad decisions. So we do have free will, but how do we get there? How do we explain that to other folks? Now, this gets compounded by the fact that there is, in neuroscience, there are some studies out there that would suggest that we don't have free will. There are also some studies out there that do suggest that we have free will, and you can really get into the weeds very quickly if you start in on any of that and your head hurts. Mostly because most of us are not brain surgeons, and so it gets complicated and thorny. But there will be folks who will say that neuroscience tells us we don't really have any choice in our actions, that it's governed by other things. We don't make those decisions. The trick for us is that we do make them. We live out every day as if we do make decisions, whether they are foreordained or not. We feel like we make them. Now they may be guided by other things that are going on around us. Those decisions may be precipitated by decisions that other people make. But we have choice. We have the ability to make decisions and to choose. But what do we do then with the folks who come up and say, but there is no such thing as free will? Or in any case, when folks come up to us and they raise an issue like this. In this case, my first thought would say, well, I think we do have free will because we still make our own decisions. But then I ask two really important questions. Why and how? Why do you believe this, or how have you come to make that statement? Because this is generally where the problem comes up at. Is that more often than not, when someone begins to make that kind of statement, it's really there's something else that's going on. They are dealing with something that has led them to that point of making that question, because that's something that really comes out of left field. And what we've got to know is the journey that gets them from home plate all the way up the sideline into right field, and then across the outfield into left field. We've got to know how they get from that place to there, because that's typically where the trouble starts, and it's something back in that way that is leading them to that question. And so that's what we've got to figure out. You can ask how and why, and that will get you, over a long period of time, get you back to what was going on. That there is something that has gone on in their life that is hard for them to understand, that is hard for them to deal with or process, and they think, well, no one can make a decision like that. There must have been something else controlling what they said or did. And that's really where the issue comes in at, is somewhere along that journey. And for us as Christian people, this is where God calls us to go a lot of times, is not to offer easy, it's not to offer easy answers. time to time. It's not to offer easy answers, but to say, well, we can go on this journey with you for a while and help you figure out how you got to that place and figure out what was going on, the real trouble behind that. Now, that's not an easy thing to do, and that's going to take time. And that's where we've got to figure out how we do that. Because that's a much longer journey for us to be on, but that is what God calls us to sometimes, is, to hear the question that someone asks, but to know that there is something else that stands behind it that has led them to that point. If you can get to that something else, then with God's help we can get there, then we can help them process kind of through that, and then oftentimes that other part disappears. But that's the challenge we face. Now, I looked at my watch to make sure that we are getting close to time. I still had several questions left to answer. Send me your questions anytime you have them. I will try and answer them. I've got some of the other ones that I will put up in blog posts or something, or I'll put those answers out somewhere to be found. Because they are good questions, they're fun questions, and oftentimes they're ones that we've all had that maybe would help to have someone answer for us, or at least make an attempt at an answer with anyway.